Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 4th, 1877. It is the chaotic aftermath of the previous fall's presidential election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. Tilden had won the popular vote by a pretty considerable margin and was one electoral vote shy of winning, with a number of southern states yet to submit their final slate of electors, which is when things got very, very messy. These holdout states threatened to send rogue electors to certify the vote or multiple competing electoral slates, and there wasn't really a system in place by which to deal with this kind of chaos, these kind of contested votes. So basically, and we'll get into this, that they improvised. There were lots of twists and turns, and at the end of the day, right in this moment that we're marking, early February, a small group of appointed officials basically hashed it out, and they cut a deal, effectively ending Reconstruction in the South in return for votes in favor of the Republican Hayes. And so it was Hayes, not Tilden, who was sworn in as the 19th president of the United States, succeeding Ulysses S. Grant. Reconstruction basically comes to an end, changes the course of American history. So let's talk about this very messy and very resonant moment of electoral shenanigans, or as our researcher Jacob Feldman put it in the prep doc, it's that time that a secret cabal sort of did decide an election. So there you go. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Before we get to the shenanigans, let's wind it back to that election in the fall of 1876. Someone want to take a crack at kind of basically laying out Tilden's politics, Hayes's politics, what parties they belong to, what those parties meant in that moment, and then we'll get into what happens after the very contested vote.
Sure. This is a really highly contested election. This is still not long after the Civil War. Reconstruction is, not inevitably coming to a close, but very much on edge. And so when we think about Hayes represents really, I would say, one of the last Republican presidents, and Tilden representing sort of like a Southern Democratic Party. And at this time, when you think of the Republicans, you should think of them as sort of what we might consider more progressive. They were for Reconstruction. They were for the end of slavery. They were for all of the things that Lincoln and Grant were trying to push as a country. I mean, you think about Tilden, the Southern Democratic bloc is feeling very much resentful and marginalized after the Civil War. They resent the fact that federal troops are still occupying southern states and sort of dominating what can happen and what can't happen. And so they want the North out of their politics. They want Republicans out of their state. And this contentious election sort of comes to a head with these two figures.
One salient quick fact in there, just to highlight, there are, like, at this moment, actual federal troops in the South, right?
Yes, yes.
Right. So that was going to be very key.
And one other thing just to add on top of all of this, it is absolutely the case, as we will get into, that particularly these Southern Democratic politicians were all for upholding white supremacy, as was Tilden. But the way that Tilden runs his campaign is he positions himself as a reformer. He was responsible for helping bring down the Tweed machine in New York. He pointed to corruption in the Grant administration and said, I'm going to come in and clean up the federal government. And the Democrats at the time pointed to the Republican Party and said, well, all the Republican Party has is all these old complaints about the Civil War. They're waving the bloody shirt. Like, they don't have anything to offer. And so the way that they were framing the election was it's reform versus this kind of old, tired way of doing things.
Right. So the election doesn't fully cleave onto, or at least the way the candidates are framing themselves doesn't fully cleave onto a kind of Reconstruction, South versus North, so forth. I mean, Tilden, we should point out, is from New York, right? It's not exactly like a Southerner versus a Northerner, in these clean ways.
But as we'll talk about, I mean, issues in this election that are contested are entirely about Reconstruction and about Democratic efforts to disenfranchise both Black and white Republican voters in their states.
So I know we're not focused on the election here, but it is good table setting. But why is it that Tilden wins by a sort of considerable margin and does have this very slim electoral college vote heading into this moment that we're going to talk about? Does that indicate something about where the country's at as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it's both their frustrations with the Grant administration. There, some corruption in the Grant administration that people are tired of. There had been a pretty serious depression in 1873. And for white Northerners, they were a little less focused on Reconstruction, a little less focused on protecting Black rights in the South, and a little more concerned about issues around the economy. And also, again, there's violent efforts at disenfranchisement in the South that are also playing into the vote tallies, right? There are people who are prevented from voting or their votes aren't tallied, and that benefits Tilden as well.
One little tidbit, you talk about Tilden running as a reformer and talking about how he'd broken up corruption in New York. One thing he claimed was that he was responsible for breaking up the so-called canal ring, which was all these contractors who were overcharging and colluding as they were building the Erie Canal and so forth. So we're putting canal ring on the list. That's a great little story. I'll also say I think there's there's a little tidbit in that in the first episode of that show, The Gilded Age, and I will just say, that's basically the amount of The Gilded Age I could get through was to that midway point of that first episode, but I did catch the little reference to corruption in the building of the canal, so there you go. But let's go now then to what happens in the wake of this election. As we say, Tilden wins the popular vote, has a little bit of a slim electoral lead, but we have these 4 southern states kind of holding out and saying, we're not ready to send our electors yet. We're not really ready to proclaim where we stand. Why is it that these states are holding out?
So these states, Florida, of course, Florida, Louisiana,
of course,
South Carolina,
of course,
and Oregon.
Oh,
interestingly, Oregon sort of the plot
course.
twist. A little bit of the plot twist, but for the most part, southern states, and what you would call far west, they're still almost like frontier states. They had problems with their electoral votes, which weren't really included in the results. And a lot of these states made complaints that legal actions were taken against these Republican-controlled canvassing boards that had disqualified Democratic voters. And so they were basically saying, our votes have not been cast yet, and our votes are being marginalized, and we want to come to a clear sort of decision about how these votes are going to be cast. And it becomes so contested that essentially Congress is facing a real conflict about what to do with these electoral votes from these 4 states and how to count them in a way that doesn't set off chaos.
Yeah, because normally what happens is the vote is certified and one single slate of electors is sent into the Electoral College, but there's no mechanism for dealing with 2 slates being sent to the Electoral College. There's no person who is supposed to decide. They hadn't really plan for this contingency, and now they have these multiple slates of electors, and they're like, well, who chooses which ones get counted?
And in the meantime, perhaps understandably, but not laudably, Tilden supporters are really upset, and they're calling for public violence. They're calling to mobilize the National Guard. They want Republicans to use federal troops to come in and sort of lower the temperature and or coerce these states into sending along their electors. And I think the big thing is that there's just this impasse because the Constitution leaves this gap. I mean, at some level, it's also the case, and I think we're seeing this now, that's you can look to the laws to try and enumerate all the different scenarios and the processes to deal with them. But at some level, if people are going to go rogue, they're going to go rogue. And that's part of the story here, too. And so, maybe it would have been nice to say, here's what you do when states are going rogue, but it's also ultimately about these states sort of holding out and claiming that there's a fraudulent election going on here. So Grant kind of starts to intervene, and he hastily passes a very kind of important seeming and consequential act, and something that, you would like to think doesn't get passed as an emergency, but he basically assigns the Electoral Commission Act, and that says, oh, well, we didn't have a system, now we do have a system. And it basically sets up a commission, 5 members named by the House and named by the Senate, and 5 justices from the Supreme Court, and they're basically going to get together and, 15 men in a room and get it done.
Hash it out.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
This was their plan. They thought that they had it set up so that it was kind of 7-7 and then 1 independent. And so the swing vote would fall to this 1 independent, Justice David Davis. But then Davis gets plucked off the court to accept a Senate seat in Illinois. And his replacement was, drumroll, a Republican. And so now you have an 8-7 split between Republicans and Democrats. And you will be shocked to learn that this commission votes 8-7 on seating the Republican slate of electorates.
Incredible. I mean, it all comes down to this Davis character who kind of they thought that they'd gotten him on board with Tilden. And, I don't know. I haven't gone down the Davis route. By the way, David Davis, come on. Part of me wonders if he's just like, I want no part of this. And he just says, like, I'm going to go take my Senate seat and I'm good.
Yeah.
Sort of walking out of the room, or maybe someone else got in his ear or whatever. But, it is part of what we're seeing now, too, which is like people just opting out when it gets really hard, right? And for understandable reasons sometimes, but, people just bail. And I think this sort of feels resonant in that way, too.
I was going to say the interesting thing, though, is that even though Hayes becomes the effective president of the United States after this, the Democrats still sort of win. They still have a lot of victories when it comes to this. I mean, I don't want to necessarily call Hayes like a puppet administration, but in a lot of ways, he's crippled from making any of the sort of like progress that Reconstruction would have kept going. Because after that deal is struck, Hayes's hands is kind of tied in terms of what the Southern Democrats want in exchange for his presidency. And he basically forfeits Black rights in order to keep the presidency.
This is what's known as the Compromise of 1877. So the Republicans have the votes on this commission, but that doesn't mean that Southern Democrats see this as legitimate. And so how do you get them to accept this as the result? And they make this deal, the Republicans and the Democrats, that Hayes will become president. There's not going to be this big to-do from Southern Democrats, but Republicans are going to remove federal troops from the South, along with a number of other concessions. And removing federal troops from the South, that's what ends Reconstruction, because Reconstruction was only happening at gunpoint. It required the military in order to enforce Black rights in the South. And even then, like, Black people in the South were facing a tremendous amount of violence. So this is the cost of Hayes's victory.
Yeah. And it's not just the removal of federal troops from the South. It's also the South wants to industrialize. The South wants railroads that are going to cut through the South. They want more industry to come through the South. They want to make the South sort of look a little bit more like the North to maintain not just political supremacy, but also economic supremacy.
Kellie, on this larger question of Reconstruction, we've touched obviously on this era a bunch on this show. We've talked about Hayes a little bit on this show, but after the Civil War, right? There's Johnson, Grant, Hayes. I think all three of them are seen as kind of eroding Reconstruction in their own way. But like, where? I know this isn't a simple question, but where do you pin kind of the real turning point? Is it at this moment with Hayes that it just sort of says like the promise of Reconstruction kind of really fully died here, or was he just playing out the string that had started with Johnson? Because Johnson also gets a lot of flack.
Johnson doesn't help Grant is not that much better, to be honest. But I would put it on Hayes. I mean, Hayes is the one that really basically maintains his power at the expense of Black people. And so everything that you sort of saw, Black elected officials, Black suffrage, Black men voting, Black people being able to, ride trains and have entrance into hotels and restaurants and like the passing of the Civil Rights Act, all of that gets rolled back within a few years. Black people's rights are completely limited. And even less than that, you have all of these Black officials that are no more, certainly at the local and the state level. So at the federal level, you might still have, a few Black elected officials. But within a short amount of time, those Black municipal leaders, those local elected officials, they're out of the job.
You see this as the outcome of the bargain or the compromise of 1877. And I think it's worth looking at a commission that's put together a few years after the election, the Potter Commission, which goes back and it's like, what actually happened in the 1876 election? Like, was there fraud? What was going on? And they conclude that they don't find any evidence of wrongdoing by the president or by President Hayes or by Tilden, but they do. At the same time that they're conducting this investigation, the New York Tribune publishes a series of coded telegrams that Democratic Party operatives had sent during the weeks following the election, where they're trying to bribe election officials in order to sort of move the results in their direction. And that combined with the Democratic Party's strategy of using vigilante groups before the election to try to keep Republicans from voting, They didn't win the presidency from this, but through violence and bribery and scheming and a secret cabal, they are actually able to arrange the end of Reconstruction and begin the process of instituting Jim Crow. And for white Southerners, that was maybe more of a win than 4 years in the White House.
I think this moment shows you that, the seat of power is not the presidency. The seat of power is actually at these local state laws that are able to maintain white supremacist control over their majority Black populaces in some instances. I mean, that is where you start to see the real power is with the states. And that the president doesn't have that much control or authority. And in some ways, it's just limited. And once Southern Democrats saw that they could sort of navigate outside of the presidency, get rid of these federal troops, and that's all we need. And then they were running the show once the troops were gone.
They knew that they had a moment to leverage power, even if it didn't mean winning at a kind of top line level. Yeah. And it's very instructive. It's funny, and this is, but in my kind of ongoing look at whether names are appropriate or inappropriate for these moments. So this is called the Compromise of 1877. Yeah. What is it? Just like 30, 40 years earlier, we have the Corrupt Bargain, right? Which we haven't done an episode on. It's a whole other thing. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's basically the wake of an election. It's contested. Some stuff goes down, and they call it the Corrupt Bargain. But if you go and look at the Corrupt Bargain, it was actually just a really close election, and they figured. Whereas this should be the Corrupt Bargain.
Yes,
this is the Corrupt Bargain. Right?
Yes.
And it's just a bummer that name was off the table by the time this came around.
This is so funny, Jody, because I was thinking about this morning as well. I was like, oh, it's so sanitized, the compromise of 1877. But I think it reflects a mode of politics that would come to define the kind of looking back at Reconstruction and the Civil War in the decades that followed, which is, look, we all came together. And all it cost was the rights of Black people. And the people who were involved in the compromise were just fine with that. And on they went. But I do think that language there, I think you're right. It really matters. It's doing a lot of work.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Completely sanitizing. And in some ways, I would say what it is deceptive at best.
Yeah. One last note when we're talking about names and so forth. In the wake of this, Tilden supporters who were sort of upset about, the outcome here clearly started to call Hayes Rutherford be Hayes. I'm into it. I like it. I think
I'm totally down for it. It's very clever.
Yeah, I think
whatever. Rutherford.
Yeah, exactly. Part of me is like, would Trump have done better? But part of me thinks that's exactly what Trump would have come up with, and I would have begrudgingly been like, yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah, fraud would have been in all caps.
Right. Yeah.
Rutherford BAs.
Anyway, okay, we will leave it there with the true corrupt bargain. Let's call it that. Let's rename it here on this show. So that brings us to the end of that episode. But we should talk about some other, also on this day's, other things that happened throughout history on February 4th, as we like to do from time to time. I'm going to take the first two here, but in 1783, King George, Britain's King George proclaimed a formal cessation of hostilities in the American Revolutionary War, and then 6 years later, electors chose George Washington to be the first president of the United States. So lots happening in early February. Those moments are on the brain because I've said ad nauseum, I'm watching that John Adams series and I like it. And so I'm like, oh yeah, I saw that. George Washington, he was tall. Yeah.
And in 1801, John Marshall was confirmed by the Senate as Chief Justice of the United States.
Now we're going to leap forward about 2 centuries. In 1997, a civil jury in Santa Monica, California, found O.J. Simpson liable for the deaths of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ron Goldman. Y'all, I'm teaching a class in the 90s right now, and we're almost to this moment, and my students are so psyched.
Not the
97
trial,
moment, apologies. The O.J. Simpson story as a whole. Yeah. But the civil trial will be a little coda.
No, I know it's an interesting coda, and I mean, I think it shows you kind of how much the civil trial just did not seep in. There was no, if a civil trial convicts, you must. It just doesn't work, and so there you go. Or if a civil trial finds you liable, you must be it just doesn't work. Yeah.
Doesn't work.
2004, this is when the social networking site Facebook had its beginnings. Mark Zuckerberg is holed up at Harvard, and he launches the Facebook. And I don't want to be too snippy here, but the fact that it is early February, Mark Zuckerberg, it's cold in Boston. He's holed up, reportedly just can't get girls to talk to him. The vibe feels right to me. That was basically the impetus of starting the Facebook. I'd like girls to interact with me a little bit more. So the fact that it happened in the dead of winter makes scans for me. So there you go.
And right before Valentine's Day.
Yeah, right before Valentine's. Oh, yeah, that's it. He's like, I got 10 days.
Lady.
I love it.
Who's take?
That's why you pin these stories to days of the year, so you see these little wrinkles. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avergan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.